Hello lovelies, this is likely to run long, so settle in. I've procured a copy of the Cyberpunk RED Jumpstart kit and we're going to go through it. I have extensive experience with Cyberpunk as a game and I always preferred it to Shadowrun. Keep your elves out of my Cyberpunk. I've been playing Cyberpunk since the black boxed set 2013 and I bought that in a Games Workshop, which kind of dates me, I guess, back when Games Workshop was still selling RPGs generally and weren't a gulag, essentially, for Warhammer players. I mean, they still don't even sell Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. What are they even for? I don't know. But that would have been, what, 88, 89? Because Games Workshop went all kind of closed ecosystem around 1990. That would have been White Dwarf 100 back in the day. So there you go. Yeah. So that was a black box with some pretty cool art in it and separate books. And it was going for a more realistic feel in the combat, and it was really rather kind of limited, but it was really accessible. And then it wasn't too long after that we got Cyberpunk 2020, which people still love. We won't talk about 3rd edition. What's important here about Cyberpunk RED, I think that people understand, is that it is not Cyberpunk 2077. This is set in the 2040s. It's a kind of interim between the end of the 2020 source books, which was about 2025, I think it ran to, with the Fourth Corporate War. So it's kind of at the midpoint between the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2077. But I think it indicates some sort of directions and shifts and changes, though I think it's hard to tell reading through this how much they've simplified because it's a Jumpstart kit, and how much they've simplified because that's kind of the way that rules go these days. It's hard to tell exactly how much is an indication of what's going on. Now, I have a Cyberpunk campaign coming up next year, and I'm not sure whether I'm going to try and implement these rules or wait for the full version, or whether I'm going to stick to using old school 2020 rules, which in many ways are quite a bit superior to these. I think 2020 is still the way to go for me personally, but this is interesting and we see some various things in there. So let's start with the setting book, the world book, because I think it's the story that generally hooks people, isn't it? Okay, that's working. Sorry, I'm stumbling about a bit because I'm using OBS to record videos. It's a bit new for me. Okay, it looks like quite a lot of the art is taken from concept art and promotional stuff from 2077. Some of it seems to have been done independently, but it's fairly apparent that a CD Projekt Red, probably hence the red, have been involved and supplied some money there too. But it is still a fairly old school layout, though it seems to be full colour, which would be a departure for Cyberpunk. It'll be interesting to see how that all comes out. Of course, full colour is going to drive the price up and everything. I'm still kind of tempted to retroclone Cyberpunk 2020 and see how we go with that. But yeah, if you look at the cast and crew for that, you'll see a lot of Polish names, which rather suggests that CD Projekt Red were quite heavily involved in everything that was going on. This is good, I think. It'd be nice to see Artel come back, and it's good to see Mike Pondsmith being so heavily involved in the computer game, and hopefully Cyberpunk will do well off the back of that and have a bit of a renaissance in the way that Shadowrun has to an extent, but hopefully better, because I love Cyberpunk. So this setting is really the kind of long-term aftermath of the Fourth Corporate War. So it's a lot more low-key, a lot more desperate, and perhaps not quite as technologically advanced and leapt forward as you might think it would be. Basically, humanity as a whole took a hell of a big setback from everything that happened in that corporate war. And the name RED comes from the fact that after so many orbital bombardments, a handful of nuclear weapons and so on, all this conflict across the world, the sky essentially turned red. There's so much dust and stuff thrown up in the atmosphere that the skies were red, and the sunsets and sunrises to this day are much more vivid. Hence me using this background here. So the 2020s were incredibly high tech. Everyone was doing pretty well. The corporate scuffles and so on were fairly kind of low key and involved hiring edge runners like your characters who would perform covert missions. With the fourth corporate war that was detailed in 2 supplements and has been expanded on here, things went hot, things went overt, right? So that's when everything went to shit. And if you played characters in that setting at that time, they would have been quite heavily involved in everything going to shit. I won't recap the entire fourth corporate war, but it started out between 2 corporations that hadn't really been mentioned in the setting before, particularly. There were 2 underwater shipping and technology companies sort of vying over the remnants of another company that had gone bust, and then they involved security companies, and things just basically spread from there and involved national governments and so on. And yeah, things went hot. Then by about 2022, there were like full-scale battles going on, and then the orbital strikes began. Now, orbital strikes have pretty much the effect of nuclear weapons, but without all that nasty fallout and so on. So people felt a lot freer to use them, and there were problems because this was essentially industrial technology as well as illegal military technology that was being used, but there aren't a lot of ways you can really fight back in orbit. So I guess the bright side of all this is that all of these massive explosions and all this dust in the atmosphere will have curtailed global warming somewhat, not to mention the deindustrialization of much of the world. So, you know, silver linings. The thing that's probably most directly impactful for old school Cyberpunk players is that on August 20th, 2023, unknown forces, probably player characters, detonated a pocket nuke in the upper floors of the Arasaka Tower in Night City. So this is essentially an Hiroshima-level event for Night City, though it was curtailed somewhat by the modernity and strength and militarization of the buildings. Essentially, this was an airburst because it was in the upper floors of that, and the corporate center was one of the most densely packed areas with the strongest buildings. That will have contained it to some extent. And then if you look to Japan in the wake of the 2 American nuclear strikes there, you can see that a city can recover from that if it's a small enough explosion. After that happened, you know, a nuke on American soil, even if it was in NorCal at the time, you know, this was a step too far, and the American president of the time nationalized one of the big security companies, Militech, by basically calling up its CEO, who was a reservist, thereby nationalizing that. Other countries followed suit, and that was pretty much that. That was an end to the war. Basically, the governments finally kind of flexed their muscles, used their national militaries and their economic clout and their legal clout to nationalize or otherwise curtail a lot of these mega corporations, particularly the security mega corporations. So by the time we get to Cyberpunk RED, the time of the mega corporations is kind of over, and corporations are much more limited to having national, regional or local power. It's kind of a pity because mega corporations are your like traditional enemy in cyberpunk gaming, so you kind of lose a bit of that, but it does place these corporations within the scope of player characters to work for on a more personable level, and to have more of an influence over, and to feel that they could take them on better. But yeah, we're basically looking at a a light post-apocalyptic situation here. Countries are fractured, a lot of cities have been heavily damaged, industry has been fucked over, the skies are red, depopulation has taken place. That's why it's called the Red. So this is a time of reclamation, recovery, and authoritarian politics, because the state of emergency that was declared at the end of that corporate war is still ongoing as of this time, so 20 odd years later. So you can see how the themes in some ways reflect more modern concerns than those of traditional cyberpunk. So we talk about America, because that's generally where it's set. It's fragmented and broken up in a way similar to the way it was during the time of the Wild West. So you have a civilized East Coast, if you like, which is controlled very heavily by the federal government out of Washington, D.C., which holds local elections and things, but the presidency in particular is still the same president, the same dictator, essentially. So the East Coast is civilized, in full recovery mode, but a bit oppressive, and very much still the United States. The president is President Kress, who basically took power at the start of the Fourth Corporate War and has kept hold of it. By all accounts in here, they're something of a benevolent dictator, and they do plan to step aside, but they're quite popular, they're quite a strong figure, and they're holding on to everything. And then on the West Coast, you've got fractured, broken up areas, you've got states that were independent before the Fourth Corporate War, and so on, and so others have come together as a sort of a regional power. So you have a kind of Pacific Northwest conglomerate, and you've got NorCal and SoCal, and Night City is right between Northern California, Southern California, which are both independent states. So Night City is an entirely fictional city. It has a full background. There's an excellent source book which describes the city, though most of that's going to be redundant by this point, but it's a good buy. It's a good example of how to do a really good city book. But obviously it got nuked. But Night City, you can actually look up where it's supposed to be situated. Is it San Moro Bay? I think you can find it on Google Maps, so you can know exactly where Night City is supposed to be. So it is situated in the real world, even though it's an entirely fictional city. But it basically sits right at the border of North California and Southern California, and it's kind of a free port in this setting, semi-independent even from the states or state in which it is situated, and a kind of Danzig-like free port wherein Northern California, Southern California, the rest of the Pacifica Confederacy essentially can meet and trade, and other people can. Law and order is kind of meh. And so on. And there's a lot of experiments and so on going on around there, or within Pacifica, which is interesting. Some plot hooks there with some biotech companies trying to find ways to recover the environment. So, yeah, it's all interesting. Now, what's preventing the United States from coming back together, or the president from relinquishing power, is that treaties are felt to need to exist between the United States in the east and the various independent states and so on in the west. There was an Adventure and America descriptive supplement called Land of the Free, which is worth picking up. That should have more information on the rest of the states, and you can speculate from there. That would be another thing that's worth picking up. Whatever version of Cyberpunk you end up playing, I think the old school supplements that you absolutely have to have are the equipment supplements, but if you're interested in the background and so on, then I would definitely say Night City and Land of the Free. Can't remember whether Home of the Brave was the actual supplement and Land of the Free was the adventure, or vice versa, but I think they ship together anyway, so yeah. There you go. Now the rest of the world outside America gets skimmed over in a quick start kit, which is a skim over itself, I guess. According to this, Europe took a hell of a battering in the corporate war. So Europe was held up as this big economic powerhouse, forward-thinking, highly technological in the previous ones. So not too far from reality, really. But the concerns about Europe that have blown up in the interim, and the divide between Northern Europe and Southern Europe, are kind of played out here, I think, when it talks about Italy, Spain, and Greece, which are all suffering political upheavals and so on, which isn't so different to how things are now. There is a refugee crisis, as there likely would be, with accelerated environmental degradation and the damage done to other countries. So yeah, that makes sense, and it does particularly pick out Britain as being a really violent and edge-runnery type of place, just with a lower technological base than somewhere like Night City, which is, yeah, good news for me. I like to set things in Britain if I'm not using Night City. Middle East got glassed, essentially, and has lost all of its power and most of its relevance. So that's a chaotic area, but that could be interesting, all the tribal factions and the forever wars going on there. But it's not just the Middle East, it's North Africa as well. You know, they include places like Libya. Yeah, it could be an interesting setting for a game. Give it a kind of Mad Maxy type spin, or raiding the ruins of Dubai or something, you know. That could go quite well. But yeah, the world has kind of moved on from petrol and gas, so the Middle East doesn't have anything like the influence or importance or power, and is no longer really being invaded by external powers per se. If you do base a game in the Middle East, Egypt's relatively intact. Syria, oddly, is relatively intact, and Israel is relatively intact, and probably expanding its power, I would think. Africa has always been interesting in cyberpunk setting. I don't know if you know, but it makes more sense to launch rockets from a more equatorial position. Takes less energy. Better for inserting into orbit, that sort of thing. That's why when you see like French rocket launches or whatever else, they tend to be as far to the south as possible, and that's why launch platforms and things are being considered that float, essentially, so that if you can move to an equatorial region, it's, yeah, the economics and the practicalities all make sense for that as a place to launch rockets, and it also makes sense as a place to have a beanstalk, you know, an orbital elevator, or mass drivers for hurling raw materials into combat in a relatively economically useful fashion. So Africa in the original cyberpunk setting really got a huge boost out of the space industry, to the point where a third, I think, of all workers in orbit were of African origin. This is a great way of creating a level of importance for the racial minorities, ethnic minorities, yeah, Africa as a continent that tends to often get overlooked, but in a way that makes sense within the context of the game and the game world and so on. So there was a massive amount of investment and so on in Africa. A few of the already more advanced African nations kind of picked up and ran with this and did really well out of it. And now, you know, a huge amount of the space industry is based in and around or from Africa. So while that took a bit of a hit, Africa in this setting is kind of how we currently look at India or China. It's kind of rapid development, all the social upheavals and problems that has. But that's the future. You should be learning Mandarin or Hindi or whatever else. Yeah. Asia in this new setting is much more kind of broken up. China's recovering. Hong Kong was eliminated from a biological terror attack, so rich pickings there if you're willing to deal with that. But China isn't the economic powerhouse that we think of it as today, and may have been nibbled away at a bit at the edges. So North Korea is still there, but both North and South are isolationist, the South being more high-tech. Arasaka, which was a big Japanese security corporation in the setting, has withdrawn to the Asian region, but then has tightened its stranglehold there. So, yeah, there's that to consider. Central and Southern America, there were South American wars, I think, in the original setting, which was kind of like a hot war expansion of the drug wars. Yeah, because we ran an early Cyberpunk campaign as soldiers in South America. So yeah, I mean that's a theme that's turned up in a whole bunch of other games as well ever since. But South America seems to be sort of getting its shit together in a similar way to Africa. So if you think of India and China as the up-and-coming economies in the real world, then Africa and South America kind of replace them within the setting, if you want to get some sort of idea of the kind of feel that you're going for there. Mega corporations have essentially been wiped out, nationalized, hedged in, broken up, whatever. The megacorps aren't entirely gone, but sort of local and regional areas. Yeah, they still have their power. They're still quite powerful. They're still quite dangerous. They're just more localized. And even though they've been broken up, if you've got, say, Arasaka, South Korea, Arasaka, Japan, Arasaka, Philippines, or whatever, they're probably still coordinating to an extent, but it's more like personal fiefdoms, I guess, underneath the whole corporate umbrella. And in a way, because they're decentralized in a way that national governments and so on aren't, they've weathered the storm quite well. So it's an aspect to the new setting that I don't necessarily like particularly. Okay, you get a timeline. If you remember Cyber Generation, which I quite liked, there is a mention of the carbon plague in here. So you could incorporate Cyber Generation kids into this, who would all be grown up at this point. It keeps the alternate history that it had from when it was originally published. So if you think it was originally published around, I think it was 98, 99, with Cyberpunk 2013, that's the point of divergence, is 1990 or so, right? Mike's had some good predictions, though dialed up to 11. Others, not so good. I'm not going to particularly spoil this for you. So, I mean, there's not a lot that you particularly need to know there, just that it's our world, only worse, and gets more and more divergent as you go along. Night City, it's kind of the same, but kind of not, because of the explosion that went off in the center of the city. So it's survived, but it's damaged, but it's in a position to prosper from the new world that there is. Again, there's not a huge amount to spoil or even talk about there. Particularly, it's an example, I guess. It's an example of the recovery that is going on around the world, with cities being reclaimed, dug out, and so on. So you got Hot Zone Wasteland, which is the former corporate zone, in which there may still be riches to be discovered. I really get a feel of kind of dungeon crawling in this, going into wasted cities, cratered and broken areas, places that might have bioplagues or bombs or whatever, abandoned facilities from the corporate war, things that were left behind when a corporation was forced to decamp from a particular country for whatever reason. So in some ways there's a kind of sense of a kind of post-apocalyptic dungeon crawl to a lot of this. But yeah, it's interesting. It's opportunities, but it's a different character to the way Cyberpunk used to be. But Night City is a good example of how things have been localized, and that may be the way the world's going in terms of manufacturing and everything else. There seem to be a lot more robotics and remotes, but not particularly any rules for those in this quick start stuff. So that'll be interesting to see. Now the original, this is worth mentioning, this is worth picking up on. The original Cyberpunk had cell phones that were far more restrictive and far less capable and far bulkier than the smartphones we're all carrying around today, but costing $400 a pop for a basic portable phone. Yeah, Cyberpunk got a lot of stick for that. They have updated things. So in this version, you basically get a powerful smartphone that can do 3D holographic projection, do automated smart searching and so on. But the most important, it can do everything a smartphone can and more. But it also is somewhat like the personal agent, the virtual girlfriend in the new Blade Runner, in that it has an agent built into it. That's not really intelligence, kind of semi-AI. It's a learning algorithm. It can be given a personality, a body, a face, and so on. But it's not really intelligent exactly. Per se, but it can act as like your secretary, your dog's body. It can do basic stuff. I mean, it can't hack the net or anything in particular, but it can run searches, it can monitor you, it can handle tasks, it can give you reminders. It's like having a personal assistant. You know, we offload a lot of the things we need to remember, like phone numbers, calendars, and so on, to our smartphones already. But we still have to kind of check it or set the alarms to remind us. With this, basically anyone and everyone can have access to a personal assistant and secretary who can handle most things for you to a large extent. That seems like a good way to update the technology and move forward from that, to me. So yeah, that's interesting. Weapons haven't particularly advanced since 2020. I guess if everything's been kind of knocked back, that makes sense. And you don't want to get too sci-fi with Cyberpunk. I mean, there were things like laser weapons, lightning guns, and things, but they were kind of bulky and hard to use in 2020, and they weren't necessarily worth it. They didn't necessarily pack enough power. If technology had continued unfettered, then the advances in power storage and so on probably would have made those more effective weapons. Yeah, microwave guns, things like that. A bit more Peter F. Hamilton late career than Peter F. Hamilton early career kind of weapons, but it hasn't really been shown here. It makes sense because everything's been knocked back, but still. So you've got some of your old favourites, AV4s and so on. You'd think they'd have advanced or developed a bit more, but then you got to consider, we still use the F-15, which was developed in the 1950s, at the end of the 1950s, and people still use the M16 from the 60s and so on. Incremental improvements, then jumped improvements seems to be the way that a lot of technology goes. So I guess it makes sense, especially in context. Data terms and screen sheets. Data terms were like public terminals for using the internet or the net in the old Cyberpunk. We don't exactly see that. There are internet-capable phones in the real world, but more often than not, a lot of the old telephone boxes and things have been turned into Wi-Fi hubs for people who use that. O2 in this instance, British Telecom's stuff here. You get access to the internet wireless there, which is faster than other options. So I guess data terminals kind of make sense to an extent, but they never particularly made sense even when they were brought in 2020. But then the internet isn't exactly a thing anymore, which we'll get to in a bit. Screen sheets are newspapers, but they're kind of high-speed print off. So if you need a hard copy of something, you hit print, you tear it off, and away you go. Don't think that's necessary, especially with the personal agents. Seems odd. Seems weird. But yeah. Maybe they're just hard copy options of websites, which seems to be what they're suggesting there. Data pools are kind of localized internets, because the overall net has been essentially brought down. It's good for a game, but it doesn't make sense, particularly in context. The value of international data communications is so huge, even in or especially in a fractured world. It's hard to it's hard to see how things would continue in this kind of fractured state. And it does remove the net as a thing in this setting, at least. Of course, that's all down to Rache Bartmoss releasing thousands of semi-AI versions of himself and essentially crashing the old net. They've tried to bring it back online. They can't. In that instance, what I think people would actually do would be to set up an entirely new internet. It would take a while to roll out, but you'd get it. Instead, what we have in this setting is a lot of much more tightly controlled regional nets, which seems to me to run counter to what Rache Bartmoss would have wanted. After all, information wants to be free, so putting everyone into fortress localized networks doesn't make a huge deal of sense to me. But there you go. Smart clothes are mentioned, so basically they can communicate with your agent and tell you when they're ripped, torn, about to wear out, whatever else. I guess your armor could tell you what level of integrity it has left. So that gives you a justification for knowing some of the stats and so on. Food shortages are kind of talked about, and a lot of guerrilla gardening, things like that. Automated farming, that sort of thing. It's interesting. I suggest you look into guerrilla gardening, vertical gardening, things like that, to think how people will be operating to feed themselves in this post-apocalyptic setting that they have here. Media's covered. I guess with the fracturing of the net, there would be an opportunity for media companies to come back, so that's one thing you can do there. The nature of the net has also changed, but we'll come to that later. A lot of things are familiar: mercenaries, trauma teams, which is like paramilitary ambulances. Nomads seem to have come up in importance due to the fractured nature of the world. These are ideas for how you can put groups together, so corporate groups, bands, salvagers and reclaimers, trauma teams, mercenaries, cults or gangs, nomad packs, a band of lawmen. Again, that's fractured and gone local, but that means you have a lot more latitude as law enforcers, so that's interesting. Media teams, you could play a media startup. that could be interesting. And then it's got some ideas for missions, but this is Cyberpunk. Some random encounters which aren't particularly deep, and then we get into the adventure stuff, which is all sort of Games Master information, which I am not going to tell you because that would be just wrong. Okay, so that's that. And we move on to the rulebook. Now, this is where things perhaps get a little bit more interesting for some people, because the rules tell you how a game plays. It also tells you a lot about what the author is intending. And again, I would say I'm not sure whether this is a slimmed down, stripped down version of the rules specifically for a quick start, a jumpstart set, or whether this indicates what they're going to go for with the main book. There is definitely going to be some surprises and concerns for people. It's a brief recap of the world and so on, some of the central ideas of it. Quick tabletop game primer, stuff you don't need to know. Street slang, you will find that your groups come up with their own slang very rapidly, or just use spins on modern slang. So Cyberpunk authors, it's kind of a joke that they write bad lyrics for songs into their stories. It's also kind of a joke that the slang is terrible. Real slang emerges organically and it evolves from what has gone before it. Trying to impose slang just sounds hokey. So in your games, I would suggest just using your own slang and switching it up a little, rather than using much of this particularly. People will come up with their own. There used to be a kind of credo for guiding how you would run Cyberpunk. Future is disposable was one of them. Live on the edge was another. Style over substance was another. These ones seem to be a bit different. It's always personal, seems to be how you're supposed to judge this. It's much less detached, it's much more personal, you have much more of a stake in your survival and so on, and that seems to be what the emphasis is. But then here's the credo: style over substance, attitude is everything, live on the edge. That's the old set of Cyberpunk rules, to which has been added it's always personal. So it's never business, I guess. The roles all look familiar. You've got rocker boys, they're kind of media performers, musicians, who you think of it as what punks want to be, what Billy Bragg wants to be. You want to change the world with your songs. You want people to sit up and pay attention. Weirdly, Insane Clown Posse would be a good example of rocker boys, because they have gathered this cult-like culture around them of juggalos. They just don't do a lot positive with it. So a rocker boy is more like Bono, I guess, if he actually had any real-world influence worth a damn. So that's how you can think of that. Solos are fighters, gunmen, mercenaries, that sort of thing. Netrunners are hackers. Techs fiddle with high-tech stuff. Medias, now they've included social influencers under medias, which is interesting, but mostly it's meant to be like reporters, investigative reporters, that sort of thing. In my ideas for my version of 2020 I'll be running next year, I replaced Rocker Boy with Influencer because it made more sense. It would encompass the old one, but it would also reflect the way new media works in real life. So there you go. Lawmen, cops essentially, execs, corporate officers, power brokers, dealers, that sort of thing. Not drug dealers. Fixers are your drug dealers, your pawn brokers, your smugglers, your information brokers, your huggy bears, that sort of thing. And nomads are bikers, people moving from place to place. Yeah, it's kind of survivalist bikers is the way to think of them. Basic stats, most of that will be familiar. So you've got intelligence, reflexes. They've separated out dexterity, which is interesting. So reflexes isn't going to be the ultimate power stat that it used to be, but then maybe dexterity is. Tech, how au fait with technology you are. Cool, keeping you cool, right? Not how cool you are. Will. Did we used to have will? I don't remember, but that's interesting. Luck, which we used to have. Move. That's kind of an artifact of the old game and also of playing with minis, which we never did with Cyberpunk, so move hardly ever came up. So I'll be interested to see whether they've done anything extra with that. Body, which is your overall strength and toughness, kind of a power stat. And empathy, which is your ability to relate to other people, and also what gets eroded by cyberware biting into your humanity. Now, instead of the wound track, we have hits, and it's basically divided three ways in the same way that 4th edition was, 4th edition D&D. So you have your maximum hits, halfway through you become seriously wounded and take some penalties, then you start dying when you hit 0. I'm not sure how I feel about that, particularly. It's a simplification, which is good for streamlining play, but I just don't know how I feel about it. It might be a step too far for me. Don't get me wrong, I quite liked that in 4th edition, and it's something that I've introduced into other D&D-like games that I play. But Cyberpunk, hit points, not sure about that. Yeah, just really not sure about that. What's interesting or weird, perhaps, with the sample characters that they give you. You get sample characters, you get some cutout paper stand-up figures, and you get starting adventure on top, and cheat sheets. Explain the rules very briefly. So useful stuff. You get that on top of all this. But what's interesting is they've got a random array of stats. If you're playing a con scenario or whatever, your characters can end up different. You roll a d6 and read off the stats across. Not sure how I feel about that, but that's not how it is in normal play. That's just for these example characters. I guess it throws a little bit of a mix in, I suppose. Skills seem to have been simplified and consolidated, and again, I'm not sure how I feel about that, but then I've been doing a lot of thinking about how to make skills a bit more realistic, a bit more rational, I guess, in gaming. So this kind of runs counter to the way I'm thinking. I think we need to add, not complication, but more simulation in how we do skills. Cyberpunk's gone the other way with a simplification and a consolidation of skills, and I'm not sure about that. I don't like that. It's one of the few things I don't like about 5th edition D&D, is that it's moved away from 3rd edition's more complex skills into much simpler skills. So it's just personal taste. I don't know how you'll feel about it. So your stats are grouped now. So you've got intelligence, willpower, cool, and empathy are considered mental. Tech is technique, not technology. Okay, but it's still used the same way. Okay, so technique and reflexes are your combat group. Manipulate tools or instruments. Okay, I guess that's where it crosses over. Luck, you spend luck points in your favour to alter rolls. It's a very small pool, but it can make a difference, and it is what makes an edge runner, I guess. And then your physical group is your body, your dexterity, and your movement. Your dexterity sounds like it's more like agility. It's your whole body agility. It gives you ways of making your stats. So you got templates, costs, and so on. Hit points. I don't know how I feel about hit points. Instinctively, I'm against it. But we'll see. So that scales with your body. So at body 2, you have 10 hit points. You get crippled essentially at 5 hit points, and your death save is 2. And then at 10, you get 50 hit points. Your win threshold is 25, and your death save is 10. So skills, like I say, they've been consolidated. It's a severely shortened list. Whether that's because this is a quick start or whether that's what they mean, don't know. And then there's role abilities. So when you choose a role, a character class, essentially, you get certain special abilities that allow you to do certain things. So netrunners can interface and so on. Not particularly a fan of restrictive classes. But as a sort of starting character with those particular skills, that makes sense. Personally, I would let people diversify and take bits from other roles, but that's just me. Life path is pretty much just as simple as the old one. I was hoping it would be a bit more complex, but again, this is a quick start. We don't know. Cyberware is interesting. Now, there's been some controversy about them being anti-trans and so on, and one of the main lines of argument that people have made towards Cyberpunk as a whole, the game, the background, before you even get to the computer game, is somehow anti-trans. One of the things they point to is that altering your body in Cyberpunk reduces your humanity. It distances you from humanity. This is an old theme from cyberpunk fiction, from science fiction, and to suggest that that's anti-trans or anything is just profoundly ignorant of the genre, really. But they've tweaked it here. So replacing your body parts and so on does slowly drive you insane. I would personally like to expand on that and give alternatives for the ways in which it can drive you insane or give you quirks or whatever, based on the mental health profile of people who have been amputees and so on. But if they've suggested here that if what you get is for therapeutic reasons, you don't suffer humanity loss. Right? So they specifically call out gender correction surgery, but also things like if you get your arm blown off by a improvised explosive device and you get a cyber arm replacement, that wouldn't cost you, right? So I guess that kind of makes sense. I mean, you've got to be really kind of odd to genuinely want to just hack off a perfectly good limb and replace it with something, right? But if you lose a limb to an explosion or whatever, you can feel weakened, dehumanized, lesser by the wound that you've taken. So if you correct that by getting a cyber arm, it makes sense that wouldn't affect your mentality. So this makes absolute perfect sense. Things were already kind of trending that way in the older games anyway. I just hope we get more of a nuanced approach in the final book than just cyberpsychosis. So yeah, that's kind of interesting. We've got some basic cyberware here. Yeah, not going into too much detail. Things are broadly compatible with the older versions of Cyberpunk. Importing things isn't going to be really too difficult at all. They use meters and yards interchangeably, which is kind of annoying. Distances, ranges for weapons are kind of very broad. It's by category, not by individual weapon. I guess that streamlines things. Yeah, that's good. You get basically 2 actions a turn. That's fine. D10++ is your resolution mechanic. You know, same as it ever was. Difficulties and so on seem broadly the same, broadly familiar to anyone who played Cyberpunk, running from 10, which is kind of like your basic low level, you might lose, or there's a consequence if you lose, or whatever, all the way up to legendary things to do, which would be like 30 difficulty. So, you know, basically it's slightly easier. I think it used to be in 5-point steps. You go 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. Now it's 10, 14, 18, 22, 25, 30. Not much difference, really. Yeah, and you got modifiers to those rolls when you attempt to do anything. Recap on skills we got there. What to do when you don't have a skill. Things like cultural familiarity, which is quite interesting. Seems kind of nuanced for a quick start thing. So you use that in place of a skill. If you're particularly educated within a particular culture, you can be expected to have certain skills and so on. That gives you a kind of cultural jack of all trades, I suppose. That can be interesting, but I can also see it being utterly goobed. Netrunning. This is where things really start to shift and change. There is no net in the way that there was, right? And you no longer jack in, right? You no longer plug your nervous system into the net. You no longer have a full sensorium. Instead, you have goggles and a deck. And because there's no net, you have to go locally to where the thing is that you want to hack. What used to be really annoying in Cyberpunk was that for every net space action, it was only a fifth of an action for people in meat space. So you would often spend a lot of time concentrating on what the netrunner was doing, and then you'd have to do one sort of very slow thing with the people in meat space, back to the netrunner, and so on. These rules changes, this background change, is kind of an attempt to deal with that to an extent by placing you in the real world and having to get close to systems and using like field interference effects and so on to affect local systems. So because everything is like a walled garden, essentially, because so many independent networks and a lot of secure systems are completely air-gapped and not linked to the net and so on, you have to be there in person, and netrunning is now more augmented reality. And it's no longer a 5 or 10 to 1 ratio. It depends on your interface skill, right? So if your interface skill is 1, you only get 1 net action for every 1 meat space action. If you have an interface skill of 10, you get 4 actions for every meat space action. So I can understand why they've done it, but it does create some believability issues, particularly when it comes to anti-personnel programs. If you're not jacked in, how can it hurt you? how is it going to rewrite your brain or cause you to seizure or spasm or have a heart attack or whatever else if there's no direct link to your nervous system? Bit off. I also don't like that netrunners can't hack remotely, but at the same time I can see why they've made this change, to force netrunners out into the field along with the rest of the characters, and to be more like a support character in another game, someone supplying boosts or whatever, someone who can be on site and can blind cameras, set off, freon systems or alarms on the other side of this building, whatever, but you have to be local. It solves some issues, it creates others. I'm not sure quite how I feel about that. Friday Night Firefight has been replaced by Thursday Night Throwdown, which is a much less realistic but a lot more streamlined combat system. Ranges are by category now: pistol, SMG, shotgun, rifle, rockets. Damage varies by weapon type. I mean, this is quick start. Probably when it comes to the full game, there will be much more individual stats to a certain degree for weapons. So you've got a medium SMG doing 2d6 damage, the heavy pistol doing 3d6, very heavy pistol, so 44, 50 caliber, 4d6, assault rifle, so 5.56, 7.62 doing 5d6, and so on. So far, so familiar, kind of. We've actually got decent automatic fire rules now, which is good. That's something everyone used to kind of improvise and change at their table. Melee is more effective, so it encourages you to have melee characters, which is interesting, but hand-to-hand is less effective unless they're completely unarmored, in which case you can be an absolute monster in hand-to-hand combat with fisticuffs. So it's okay. One thing that has really changed is armor. This is another thing that people all used to house rule, right? Stopping power of armor has been heavily reduced, but then your hit points allow you to absorb a bit more damage, and we have a definitive rule that armor degrades when it's penetrated. Leathers always used to be between 2 and 4 stopping power. They're set at 4 stopping power. Really heavy armor used to be stopping power 25 or so. The heaviest armor in this is now 15. So reducing armor, it's going to speed up combat, it's going to make it a lot deadlier, which will offset some of the consequences of the hit points thing. But for old players, I think that's going to kind of stick in their craw a bit, that they're not as armoured as they'd like to be. And when it comes to cybernetic armour, I can see the costs of repairs and so on really kind of ramping up. Now, when you're seriously wounded, you take -3 to all checks, which seems like an odd number. When you're mortally wounded, you can continue to act, but you're taking death saves all the time, and you get -5 to all actions. So it's okay, I guess. Now, if you're paying attention back when I was talking about body, it goes up to 10, right? And your death save at body 10 is 10, so technically you can't fail because you're supposed to roll d10 under it. Basically, that's going to give you a free turn, because each consecutive turn the death save increases in difficulty, so it would drop to 9. You'd have to roll 1 to 9 or you die, and then the following turn again. It's kind of a D&D death save sort of thing. Again, I'm not sure how I feel about that per se. Reputation rules have been expanded upon, which is useful for knowing if someone's heard of you and so on. And that's pretty much it. Now, when it comes to this, it's $15 for the Jumpstart kit. For curiosity's sake, I think that's worth it. But otherwise, I think that's a bit much for a Jumpstart kit. If you're curious, it's maybe worth picking up while you wait for the main release. If you have an ongoing Cyberpunk game and you want to kind of half update it, ready for when the full game comes out, then maybe it's worth it for that. And it does advance the timeline and so on if you're a lore junkie for Cyberpunk, which I don't think that many people really are. But $15 seems a bit steep for what you get here. But I'm a cheapskate. I mean, it is over 100 pages of material, I think. It could be useful. But it's interesting to see how the rules developments are going, and it's interesting to see a cohesive set of rules after the disaster that was 3rd edition, and no dolls, and that's got to be a bonus. Zang.